Hello there dear YouTubers, my name is King1993 and today I am going to talk about something important which will help both meta and non-meta players to achieve the maximum amount of frame rates per second by using these following settings. And what are the following settings? It might shock you. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. First of all, let's talk about emulator. And the thing is, whether it is a Momo emulator which I am currently using right now, or LD player or BlueStacks, I do not care what emulator it is. But if it is an emulator which will have an FPS of 60 frame per second, okay, then I highly suggest that you change that emulator, because whether it is a first person shooter game or whether it is a fast action RPG game such as Punishing Grey Raven or Honkai Impact, this type of gameplay often relies on high refresh rate. And if the refresh rate of the game is low or the frame rates per second is low, what will happen is the gameplay is gonna lag, and that lag will cause the score to get very low or inaccurate score. Or let's say you want to get some high score, but you cannot get high score because of the frame rate. Okay, so how can we increase the frame rate? Well, first of all, whether it is Momo emulator or not, it doesn't matter. It can be any emulator, but first thing you must need to do is always download the 64-bit version. Okay, it doesn't matter which emulator it is, always download the 64-bit version, because 64-bit is always gonna be faster than 32-bit. 32-bit is an old version and 64-bit is the latest version, and because of that, any processor which has the 64-bit version, you should always download any software related to that at the 64-bit rate. Okay, not the 32-bit. Okay, this is point number one. Now point number two is, when you download any of the game, try to give it as much as CPU as possible and as much as RAM or memory as much as possible as well. Okay, because I have 16 GB of RAM, I gave it 8 GB, and this game doesn't require 8 GB, but I just gave it extra. Okay, that is something like that. And when it comes to the monitor, obviously try to go for the exact same monitor setting as your monitor resolution is, and the DPI, you can give it a DPI of 360. Now when it comes to the frame rate, always stay with a frame rate of 120 frames per second. Now why 120 frames per second and not 64 frames per second? Okay, in order for me to explain this, first of all, do understand, when I say I have set the settings to 120 frames per second, it means that I have changed the emulator setting. Okay, this is the emulator setting at 120 frames per second or 60 frames per second. Okay, this is point number one. Now point number two is in the in-game graphics. Okay, this is called the in-game graphics, which has ultra setting and it has the lowest or low setting. Okay, so in the ultra setting, the game is gonna be a lot smoother looking, but the FPS is not gonna be that much high. Okay, and when it comes to the smoothness in the movement of your character, then you must need to set everything to low as possible, except the frame rate is gonna be high. Okay, so what I did two types I did a total 4 types of test. Okay, at first I used everything at low except the frame rate is gonna be high, and then I did another one where everything is high and even the frame rate is also high. Okay, so normally this is my setting. So I have come out with this number, and before showing you this number, to understand that this is my PC setting. The processor is i3-9100 and graphics card is RTX 2060 Super. RAM is G-Skill 16 GB of 2400 megahertz of clock speed. Windows is Windows 10 64-bit. Emulator is Momo emulator 64-bit. My monitor is Mac 241C 144 Hz refresh rate. Okay, and an SSD which is Samsung 860 EVO 250 GB. Okay, so this is overall my total configuration. Now I use the different emulator setting and the in-game setting to actually come out with this number. At first I use the emulator setting and 60 with low graphics, in-game low graphics, and this is the frame rates. This is an average frame rate of 40 to 50 frames per second. Then an emulator using 60 frames per second with highest graphics, the FPS range was between 30 to 40 frames per second. Okay, so obviously with high graphics you are gonna get lower numbers. Okay, now with the emulator of 120 frames per second, basically speaking this one, so at 120 frames per second with low graphics I was getting a maximum of 70 to 90 frames per second. Rather, it was at the 90 frames per second rate, a lot more than at 70. And with highest graphics I was getting about 70 to 80 frames per second. It was fluctuating between this number, but at least I was getting more than this. Okay, sorry, more than this. So when compared with high graphics and low graphics and high frame rates and low frame rates, obviously you can see if you set the frame rates to 120 frames per second, you are still going to get a lot more frames in the game. Okay, now the question is, why does it happen? So, well, both the processor and the graphics card predetermines how much amount of frame per second it is going to produce. So when you set it to 60 frame per second, okay, when you set it to 60 frame per second, the processor and the graphics card works together and thinks that the best way to utilize this game is just by giving it a 60 frame or lower frame per second, and that is basically how the software works. So as a result, what happens is you will get lower FPS than which is already shown here. And if you were to give it high FPS rate, okay, high FPS rate, or if you allow the processing of high frame rates of more than 120, it will try its best to produce as much as frame rate as possible per second to make sure that the game stays smooth enough. So if you are a meta player, okay, for meta player, getting the high score is a definite thing. If you are a meta player, then this is the setting that you might want to go for any type of emulator you use. Or if you are a player like me who just want to enjoy something, but when you need to go meta, only then I select this low graphics mode, but majority of the time I play with this high graphics mode. So basically what I am saying, that this low graphics with 120 frames per second is more ideal for meta players, okay, for meta players, and this one is especially good for non-meta players. Okay, so this is overall my conclusion on which type of setting you should be using. And again, another thing is I do not know or do not remember that if you were to install only the 32-bit version, obviously the frame rate is always gonna be low. That is point number one. Point number two is the more RAM you give, the more it might use. Okay, now this game is a low end game. Obviously it is not gonna use more than 4 or 5 GB, but giving it an 8 GB will basically future proof it. Let's say if it for some reason need, let's say 6 GB of RAM, it is gonna use, this emulator is gonna use that 6 GB RAM, but at least you are gonna get smoother gameplay. And when you use the 32-bit, what will happen is you will only get up to 4 GB RAM available. So always download the 64-bit and not the 32-bit. Okay, so that is overall my conclusion on what type of setting you should be using. If your emulator is giving you lower than 120, sorry, if it is giving you only a maximum of 60 frames per second, use some other emulator. Okay, and see which emulator can give you a maximum of 120 frames per second. Only that emulator should be the emulator best for this type of game. Okay, unless a PC port comes out, you have to rely on this emulator or this type of emulator. And when the PC version or the PC port of these games come out, obviously we are gonna be able to enjoy it as much as we can now enjoy Honkai Impact 3rd, because at first Honkai Impact 3rd I had to play it using an emulator and the frame rate was astronomically bad, okay, but now it is astronomically good, okay, so that was difference. So anyway, if you like this video, then please give a like and subscribe and click the bell notification icons to get more of this type of topic on a regular basis. Thank you.